Live television has a way of revealing things no press junket ever could. One unexpected question, one pause that lasts just a second too long, and suddenly a carefully managed public image is tested in real time, with millions watching and no chance to rewind. Subscribe to The Truth Narrator, hit like, and share your thoughts in the comments below. This story begins on a bright studio set where conversations are supposed to feel safe, friendly, even predictable. But on this day, the atmosphere carried a subtle tension that viewers could feel before a single difficult word was spoken. The segment looked routine on the surface. A celebrated Hollywood star, a respected television host, and a live broadcast known for sharp questions delivered with a smile. Yet beneath that polished surface, the stakes were quietly rising. At the center of the moment was Reese Witherspoon, an actress whose career had been built on relatability, professionalism, and an image of warmth. For decades, she had navigated Hollywood with precision, transforming herself from a young breakout star into a powerful producer and business leader. She was known not just for her performances, but for her ability to speak confidently about women's empowerment, storytelling, and responsibility in the entertainment industry. When Reese Witherspoon appeared on television, audiences expected composure, clarity, and control. Across the table sat Sunny Hostin, a co-host with a very different but equally formidable reputation. Sunny was not just a television personality. She was a trained attorney, a journalist by instinct, and a host known for asking questions that didn't drift aimlessly. Her style was measured, deliberate, and grounded in facts. When she asked something on live television, it was rarely accidental and never careless. The stage for this interaction was The View, a live daytime program that thrives on real conversation. Unlike pre-recorded interviews, nothing here could be trimmed or softened later. Every reaction, every hesitation, every change in tone would go straight to the audience. That reality alone changes how celebrities behave. Even seasoned performers know that live TV has a way of stripping away rehearsed responses. On paper, the appearance seemed straightforward. Reese Witherspoon was there to discuss her work, her projects, and the broader themes she often championed. The hosts were there to guide a conversation that balanced promotion with substance. Viewers tuned in expecting thoughtful discussion, maybe a few light laughs, and the familiar rhythm of daytime television. But live broadcasts don't exist on paper. They exist in the moment, shaped by timing, instincts, and human reactions. As the conversation unfolded, subtle signals began to surface. The energy shifted slightly. The questions became more pointed, more specific. The smiles remained, but the pace changed. For audiences watching at home, there was a sense that the interview was no longer following the safest path. What made this moment matter wasn't raised voices or dramatic interruptions. It was the quiet weight of accountability that can appear without warning. When a host with legal training asks a question on live television, every word carries intention. When a celebrity known for control pauses before answering, that pause speaks volumes. This was not about humiliation or spectacle. It was about the fragile balance between image and reality. Reese Witherspoon represented a generation of Hollywood figures who had learned to speak carefully, thoughtfully, and strategically. Sunny Hostin represented a format that, at its best, pushes guests to clarify, to explain, and sometimes to confront the implications of their own words. For viewers, the importance of this exchange lay in what live television uniquely offers: authenticity under pressure. There are no second takes. No publicist can step in. No edit can soften a reaction once it has already aired. The audience becomes a silent witness to something unscripted and revealing. As the segment continued, body language began to matter as much as dialogue. A shift in posture, a brief glance downward, a controlled breath before responding. These are the details that never appear in press releases, but live forever in clips and memories. They are the moments that prompt viewers to ask themselves what they're really seeing and hearing. This is why this interview still draws attention. Not because it erupted into chaos, but because it demonstrated how easily a conversation can cross from comfortable to consequential. It showed how a single question, asked calmly and respectfully, can momentarily disrupt even the most seasoned media presence. And as the cameras kept rolling, with no break and no safety net, the tension didn't explode. It settled. It lingered. It invited interpretation. What followed would reveal far more than either side may have intended, not through confrontation, but through restraint. And that is where the real story begins. By the time the interview took place, Both women arrived with histories that shaped every word exchanged on that set. Nothing on live television happens in isolation, and this conversation was no exception. To understand why the atmosphere felt different, it's necessary to look at what each brought into the room long before the cameras turned on. Reese Witherspoon had reached a point in her career where she was no longer just an actress promoting a film. She was a producer with influence, a founder of a major media company, and a public figure often held up as a model of modern Hollywood leadership. Her interviews in recent years reflected that shift. She spoke less about celebrity and more about responsibility, representation, and change within the industry. Audiences had come to expect thoughtful, carefully framed answers that aligned with the values she publicly supported. But that same evolution also meant greater scrutiny. The more Reese spoke about power structures, equality, and accountability, the more closely her own words and actions were examined. In the era of social media and constant commentary, even well-intentioned statements could be pulled apart, recontextualized, or questioned. By the time she sat down on the talk show couch, she was no stranger to nuanced conversations that demanded precision. Across from her was Sunny Hostin, whose professional background set her apart from many television hosts. Sunny approached interviews with the instincts of a lawyer and the curiosity of a journalist. She listened carefully, followed threads logically, and was known for circling back to points that others might gloss over. Her role on the show wasn't to provoke chaos, but to seek clarity, especially on issues tied to ethics, social impact, and public responsibility. Sunny's presence on The View had long signaled that conversations could turn serious without warning. While the show balanced humor and warmth, it also made room for difficult topics. Guests understood that appearing there meant engaging with hosts who brought different perspectives to the table. For celebrities, that meant comfort was never guaranteed, even during promotional segments. In the weeks leading up to the interview, public discussions around Hollywood influence, representation, and accountability were already part of the cultural conversation. High-profile figures were increasingly expected not only to speak about change, but to explain how they participated in systems that shaped the industry. These weren't hostile debates, but they were probing ones, often framed through calm, direct questions rather than confrontational language. Reese Witherspoon's public image intersected with those conversations. As someone who had openly advocated for better opportunities for women and underrepresented voices, she was often praised for using her platform constructively. At the same time, that visibility placed her squarely within discussions about power and decision-making in entertainment. When someone speaks frequently about reform, audiences naturally listen more closely for consistency. Sunny Hostin was acutely aware of that dynamic. Her questions on live television often reflected what viewers themselves were thinking, but might not articulate. She had a reputation for asking what needed to be asked, even if it introduced a moment of discomfort. Importantly, she rarely raised her voice or dramatized her point. The intensity came from the substance of the question, not the delivery. As the interview approached, the conversation appeared to follow a familiar rhythm. The hosts discussed projects, achievements, and broader themes related to storytelling and culture. Reese responded with the polished ease of someone who had spent decades in front of cameras. Her tone was calm, her expressions measured. To a casual viewer, everything looked normal. But subtle cues hinted that the conversation was moving towards something more specific. Sunny's listening posture changed slightly. She leaned in, signaling engagement rather than transition. Her follow-up questions became more precise, less general. These weren't abrupt shifts, but gradual ones, almost imperceptible unless you were paying close attention. Live television thrives on these moments of transition. There is a point where a segment stops being purely promotional and starts becoming interrogative, even if the word itself feels too strong. It's the moment where a host decides to move from what a guest wants to say to what the audience wants to know. That decision, once made, cannot be undone. For Reese, this meant navigating a space where her public messaging would be gently tested against deeper implications. For Sunny, it meant balancing respect with responsibility, knowing that any question asked would echo far beyond the studio walls. Neither appeared hostile. Neither appeared unprepared. Yet the tension existed precisely because both understood the weight of the exchange. As the seconds passed, viewers could sense that something was coming. Not a confrontation in the traditional sense, but a pivot. A question that would require more than a polished talking point. A response that couldn't be entirely rehearsed. The kind of moment live television produces when preparation meets unpredictability. And when that question finally arrived, it would do so quietly, without spectacle, altering the tone of the room in an instant and setting the stage for a reaction no one could edit out. The moment arrived without a dramatic cue. No music shift, no raised voices, no warning that the tone was about to change. That is how live television often works. The most consequential moments slip in quietly, carried by a single sentence spoken in a calm, controlled voice. Sunny Hostin waited until the conversation naturally paused. Reese Witherspoon had just finished answering a question with confidence, her posture upright, her hands relaxed in her lap. There was polite acknowledgement from the table, the kind that signals a transition. Then Sunny spoke again. Her question was deliberate. It referenced Reese's public advocacy and her role as a producer and decision-maker in Hollywood. The wording was careful, framed as a request for clarification rather than an accusation. But the substance was unmistakable. It asked Reese to reconcile her public messaging with the realities of influence, responsibility, and outcomes within the industry. There was no immediate answer. For a fraction of a second, the studio seemed to hold its breath. Reese Witherspoon maintained her smile, but it tightened slightly. Her eyes shifted, not dramatically, just enough to signal that she was processing the question in real time. On pre-recorded television, this is where editors would cut. On live TV, there is nowhere to hide. Reese inhaled, then exhaled slowly. Her shoulders remained squared, but her posture subtly adjusted, as if grounding herself. These were not signs of panic or anger. They were signs of calculation. She understood the question was being asked not just by a host, but on behalf of an audience that expected sincerity. Sunny did not interrupt. She did not clarify or soften the question further. She waited. That silence, brief as it was, carried weight. In live broadcasting, silence is amplified. Viewers notice it. It becomes part of the story. Reese began her response carefully. Her tone was measured, controlled, and professional. She acknowledged the complexity of the issue, speaking about intent, effort, and the challenges of systemic change. Her words were thoughtful, but they moved cautiously, as if she were choosing each phrase with precision. This was not a rehearsed answer delivered at full speed. It was a response being constructed in the moment. As she spoke, Sunny listened intently, her expression neutral but focused. She nodded slightly, signaling engagement rather than agreement. The other hosts remained still, allowing the exchange to unfold without interruption. The audience in the studio was quiet, sensing that this was not a moment for applause or laughter. Reese paused again mid-answer. Another brief silence. This one felt heavier. She resumed, expanding on her point, emphasizing accountability and ongoing work. Her voice remained steady, but there was a noticeable shift in cadence. She was no longer in promotional mode. She was explaining herself. The camera lingered. Close-ups captured every nuance, the controlled facial expressions, the steady eye contact, the subtle tightening around the eyes. These are the details that live television preserves forever. There was no dramatic outburst, no visible breakdown. But there was vulnerability, visible in restraint. Sunny followed up, gently but firmly. She referenced Reese's words, asking for specificity. Not confrontation. Clarification. The kind of follow-up that signals the question mattered and deserved a complete answer. Again, the delivery was calm. Again, the impact was significant. Reese nodded, acknowledging the follow-up. This time, her response came more quickly, but with added gravity. She spoke about learning, about listening, about the responsibility that comes with leadership. Her language reflected awareness of the broader conversation beyond the studio, the cultural context in which her words would be received. Throughout the exchange, what stood out most was what did not happen. No one spoke over anyone else. No one raised their voice. There were no dramatic gestures. And yet, the tension was undeniable. It lived in the pauses, the pacing, the careful construction of sentences under pressure. Viewers watching at home could sense that this was one of those rare live moments where authenticity was being tested. Not in an explosive way, but in a quiet, revealing one. The kind that lingers long after the segment ends. As Reese finished her answer, there was a brief acknowledgement from Sunny. Not praise, not critique, just recognition that the response had been heard. The conversation moved forward, but the energy in the room had shifted permanently. This was the point of no return. The question had been asked. The answer had been given. and the impact of that exchange was already extending beyond the studio walls. If you're watching closely, you can feel it, the moment when a live broadcast becomes something more than television. And what happened next would make that feeling impossible to ignore. Stay with the truth, narrator, because the aftermath of this live exchange revealed just how powerful a single question can be. When the conversation moved on, the studio did not return to its earlier rhythm. On the surface, the segment continued. The hosts shifted to the next topic. There were nods, transitional phrases, a faint attempt to re-establish the light tone typical of daytime television. But something intangible had changed. The atmosphere felt denser, more aware of itself. The exchange that had just unfolded was still hanging in the air. Reese Witherspoon remained composed. She did not withdraw. She did not deflect future questions. But her posture had subtly altered. Earlier, she had leaned back comfortably, speaking with the ease of someone promoting a project she knew inside and out. Now she sat slightly forward, more deliberate, more measured in her delivery. Her answers grew shorter, tighter, as though she was recalibrating in real time. The studio audience sensed it. There was no dramatic gasp, no visible disruption. But applause cues were softer. Laughter, when it came, felt restrained. Viewers at home might not have been able to articulate exactly why the mood felt different, but they could feel it. Live television captures not just words, but energy. Across the table, Sunny Hostin maintained her steady presence. She did not press further on the earlier question. She did not revisit it or escalate the exchange. Instead, she allowed the conversation to proceed, demonstrating a critical aspect of live interviewing. Once the question has been asked and answered, the moment speaks for itself. But even in moving forward, the shift was undeniable. Reese's tone carried a new weight. When she spoke about responsibility or leadership, her phrasing was more precise than before. She avoided broad generalizations. She emphasized process over promise. It was the language of someone acutely aware that every sentence would be examined. The other hosts contributed in ways that tried to restore balance. They introduced lighter prompts, personal anecdotes, and supportive commentary. This is part of the format of The View, a table of perspectives, not a single interrogation. The show thrives on contrast. Yet the earlier exchange lingered as a reference point, coloring everything that followed. From a production standpoint, there was no visible disruption. No cut to commercial ahead of schedule. No sudden redirection. The broadcast continued seamlessly. That continuity made the moment even more powerful. It wasn't treated as a spectacle. It wasn't dramatized. It was simply allowed to exist. For Reese, the immediate impact was subtle but real. She appeared more reflective in her remaining answers. Her smile returned, but it was more reserved. Her gestures were smaller. There was an increased seriousness in her cadence. It was not defensive. It was controlled, the demeanor of someone who understands the weight of public dialogue. Sunny, for her part, demonstrated restraint. Having asked the question and received the answer, she did not dominate the remainder of the segment. She listened, engaged when appropriate, and allowed the program's natural flow to resume. Her approach underscored that the earlier moment was not personal. It was professional. When the segment concluded, the customary thanks were exchanged. Reese smiled, expressed appreciation for the conversation, and acknowledged the hosts. The audience applauded. On screen, everything looked polished. But viewers who had watched closely knew that something more nuanced had taken place. Within minutes, clips began circulating online. Not sensationalized, not edited for drama. Simply the exchange itself. In the age of digital media, live television does not remain confined to its original broadcast. It travels. It is replayed, slowed down, analyzed. The pauses become measurable. The expressions become freeze frames. Commentary followed quickly. Some viewers praised Sunny for asking a thoughtful, necessary question. Others commended Reese for responding with composure under pressure. The discussion did not fracture into hostility. Instead, it centered on accountability and the value of unscripted dialogue. That alone distinguished the moment from typical viral confrontations. Inside the studio, however, the immediate aftermath was quieter. Once the cameras shifted focus and the segment wrapped, there is often a brief exhale, a recognition that live television demands constant presence. For Reese, that exhale likely carried more weight than usual. Not because she had faltered, but because she had navigated a moment that required real-time reflection. The tension had not exploded. It had transformed. What began as a standard promotional appearance evolved into a demonstration of how public figures respond when asked to go deeper than rehearsed narratives. And that transformation was visible, even without raised voices. By the time the show moved on to its next guest, the earlier exchange had already begun to take on a life of its own beyond the studio walls. The ripple effect was subtle but undeniable. Conversations about influence, leadership, and public responsibility were reignited, not through scandal, but through a calm, pointed question delivered live. In the immediate aftermath, nothing dramatic appeared to change. Reese did not issue statements. The show did not revisit the exchange in a defensive tone. Yet the impact was embedded in the footage itself, preserved exactly as it happened. And as days passed, the significance of that quiet moment would become clearer, not because it was explosive, but because it was honest. In the days and weeks that followed, the exchange continued to resonate in ways that went beyond ratings or headlines. It did not dominate news cycles with outrage or spectacle, yet it lingered, shared in clips, referenced in commentary, and discussed in quieter, more reflective tones. That persistence is often the mark of a moment that mattered. For Reese Witherspoon, the long-term impact was not defined by backlash, but by recalibration. Her public appearances after the interview reflected a continued emphasis on responsibility, but with an even sharper focus on specificity. When she spoke about leadership, she spoke about process. When she spoke about change, she spoke about listening. The language became more deliberate, less aspirational, more grounded. Importantly, there was no visible retreat. Reese did not avoid interviews. She did not soften her presence. Instead, she appeared to lean further into the complexity of her role in the industry. That response signaled something crucial. The live moment on television had not undermined her credibility. It had challenged it, and she chose to meet that challenge with composure. For Sunny Hostin, the exchange reinforced a reputation she had spent years building. Viewers and commentators noted the restraint in her approach. She had asked a difficult question without hostility. She had allowed space for an answer without interruption. And once the moment had passed, she had moved on. That balance became a case study in how live television can address serious issues without devolving into confrontation. The broader significance lay in what the moment represented for the view itself. The program has long occupied a unique space in American media. Part conversation, part debate, part cultural mirror. This exchange underscored why live talk shows remain relevant in an age dominated by edited clips and scripted statements. They offer something increasingly rare: unscripted accountability. Media analysts pointed out that the clip endured because it resisted easy categorization. It wasn't a gotcha moment. It wasn't a viral meltdown. It was a demonstration of how power, influence, and public image can be examined calmly, in real time, without theatrics. That subtlety made it more powerful, not less. Culturally, the moment aligned with a broader shift in audience expectations. Viewers no longer look only for charisma or relatability from public figures. They listen for consistency. They watch for how people respond when asked to explain the implications of their influence. In that sense, the exchange became part of a larger conversation about leadership in public life. What makes this moment endure is not what was said verbatim, but what was revealed between the lines. The pauses, the recalibration, the awareness that live television demands presence, honesty, and adaptability. These are qualities that cannot be manufactured after the fact. Years from now, this interview may not be remembered as a dramatic confrontation. It will be remembered as an example of how a single, carefully framed question can shift the tone of a conversation, and how the response to that question can shape perception just as powerfully. In an era where so much media is edited, filtered, and refined, moments like this remind audiences why live broadcasts still matter. They capture people as they are, not as they wish to appear. And sometimes that quiet authenticity leaves the deepest impression. If you value stories that look beyond headlines and examine what really happens when the cameras are rolling, subscribe to the Truth Narrator. Like this video, share your perspective in the comments, and pass it along to others who believe that the most revealing moments are often the calmest ones.